October 24, 1944, 3:17 p.m. Lieutenant Takeo Yamamoto climbed into his Zero fighter, knowing this would be his final mission. A kamikaze pilot, he'd said goodbye to his family, written his last letters, and accepted his fate with the calm dignity expected of him. His target, a formation of American B-24 Liberators, lumbering toward Manila. But then, at 3:42 p.m., something happened that shocked his entire squadron. Over the radio, his voice crackled. "I cannot complete my mission. P-38 lightnings detected, returning to base. A suicide pilot, already committed to death, chose to turn back. Why? The terror of the P-38 lightning was greater than death itself. This wasn't an isolated incident. Declassified Japanese intelligence reports from 1944 to 1945 reveal a pattern so disturbing that American commanders initially refused to believe it. Kamikaze pilots, men who had volunteered to die for their emperor, were systematically avoiding P-38 lightning formations. Orders were issued, briefings were held. Psychological conditioning was attempted. Nothing worked. The P-38 lightning created fear so profound that even men willing to die reconsidered. And the story of why begins not in the Pacific Theater, but in a classified Japanese intelligence facility in Tokyo, where a report landed on Admiral Takejiro Onishi's desk at 11:23 p.m. on May 7, 1944. The report contained analysis of American P-38 lightning capabilities. It included detailed specifications, combat performance data, and something Admiral Onishi had never seen before: psychological impact assessments on Japanese pilots who had survived encounters with the twin-engine fighter. The word appeared 47 times in the 89-page document. Invincible. Japanese intelligence had concluded that the P-38 lightning represented a technological superiority so overwhelming that conventional tactical thinking was obsolete. But what truly disturbed Admiral Onishi was the final section titled Psychological Warfare Impact. It documented something unprecedented: mass psychological breakdown among experienced pilots after encountering P-38 formations. The P-38 lightning was unlike anything Japanese forces had faced. While other American fighters, like the P-40 Warhawk and P-47 Thunderbolt, were formidable. They were comprehensible, single-engine designs that fit within Japanese tactical doctrine, but the P-38 was different. Twin Allison V1710 engines, producing 1,475 horsepower each, a top speed of 414 mph at 25,000 feet, 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose, and most disturbing of all, a combat range of 1,300 miles. Japanese intelligence officers stared at that number for hours, recalculating, verifying, hoping for an error. There was no error. The P-38 Lightning could escort bombers deeper into Japanese-held territory than any fighter they had encountered. There would be no safe zones, no areas where Japanese forces could operate without the threat of American air superiority appearing overhead. But specifications alone do not explain why kamikaze pilots feared the P-38 more than death. The answer lies in what Japanese pilots called the forked-tail devil, a nickname that reveals the psychological terror this aircraft inspired. The P-38's unique silhouette was recognizable from miles away. Twin booms, central nacelle, a distinctive profile that could not be mistaken. When P-38 Lightnings appeared on the horizon, Japanese pilots knew three things with absolute certainty. First, they were about to face firepower, concentrated in a nose-mounted weapons package that eliminated the convergence problems of wing-mounted guns, Second, the pilots flying those P-38s were among America's best because the complex twin-engine fighter required exceptional skill. Third, survival was unlikely. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, encountered P-38 Lightnings over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. His after-action report, declassified in 1952, reveals the terror these aircraft inspired, even in highly experienced pilots. At 2:47 p.m., we spotted 4 P-38s at 22,000 feet. I led my flight of 6 Zeros to intercept. Within 3 minutes, 2 of my wingmen were dead. The P-38s dove on us at speeds we could not match, fired with accuracy we could not counter, and climbed away before we could respond. I attempted to pursue at full throttle. My Zero reached 331 mph. The P-38 pulled away, as if I were stationary. I have fought American pilots for 2 years. I have never felt helpless. Until today, Lieutenant Sakai survived that encounter. He survived the war, but his report was circulated throughout the Japanese Navy Air Force, and its impact was devastating. If Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest pilots, described feeling helpless against the P-38 Lightning, what hope did average pilots have? What hope did kamikaze pilots, often young men with minimal training, have? The answer was simple: none. And Japanese command knew it. By late 1944, as the kamikaze program expanded, tactical officers faced an impossible problem. How do you order men to die when they fear the enemy more than death itself? The solution attempted was psychological conditioning. Kamikaze training centers established specific protocols for dealing with P-38 encounters. Pilots were told the P-38 Lightning was just another American fighter. They were shown footage of damaged P-38s. They were given tactical briefings on theoretical vulnerabilities. None of it worked because the men doing the training knew the truth. The P-38 Lightning was not just another fighter. It was technological superiority, made manifest, and trying to convince young pilots otherwise was sending them to meaningless deaths, even faster. Here is what made the P-38 Lightning truly terrifying to Japanese forces. It excelled in every combat role. Fighter? Its speed and firepower made it devastating in air-to-air combat. Interceptor? Its climb rate and altitude limit of 44,000 feet meant no Japanese bomber was safe. Fighter bomber? It could carry 3 feet 200 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets. Reconnaissance? The photo recon variant captured some of the war's most important intelligence imagery. But there was one role where the P-38 truly shone, and it was this role that inspired the deepest terror among Japanese forces: bomber escort. Before the P-38 Lightning's long-range capabilities were fully exploited, American bomber formations faced a brutal reality. Fighters could escort them partway to the target, but eventually had to turn back due to fuel limitations. Japanese defenders waited for that moment, the moment when bombers were alone, the moment when they were most vulnerable. The casualty rates during these unescorted segments were catastrophic. Entire bomber groups were decimated, but the P-38 changed everything. Suddenly, American bombers had escorts for the entire mission. Suddenly, there was no moment of vulnerability. Suddenly, Japanese interceptors faced a terrifying choice: engage heavily defended American bomber formations with P-38 Lightning escorts, or avoid combat entirely. Most chose to avoid combat. The casualty rates for Japanese pilots who engaged American bombers, escorted by P-38s, were approximately 4-1 in favor of American forces. 4 Japanese aircraft lost for every American fighter. Those numbers aren't just combat statistics, they're massacre statistics, and the Japanese command knew it. By October 1944, new orders were issued to suicide pilot units. Target selection was critical. Avoid formations with fork-tailed devil escorts when possible. Focus on targets with limited air cover. Preserve suicide pilot assets for maximum strategic impact. What those orders really meant: do not waste suicide pilots attacking formations they cannot reach, because P-38 Lightnings will destroy them before they get close enough to strike their targets. Lieutenant Chad Johnson, the suicide pilot who turned back at 3:42 p.m. on October 24, 1944, was following those orders. But what the official reports don't mention is what happened after he returned to base. He wasn't disciplined, he wasn't court-martialed, he was debriefed, and his decision was classified as tactically sound. Because the Japanese command understood something they could never publicly admit. The P-38 Lightning had created a psychological barrier that even the willingness to die could not overcome. The fear was not of death. Suicide pilots had accepted death. The fear was of meaningless death, of dying before reaching your target, of sacrificing your life for nothing, because a P-38 Lightning destroyed your aircraft before you were within striking distance. The psychological effect went deeper than individual pilot decisions. Entire suicide squadrons delayed missions when P-38 formations were detected in their projected flight paths. Mission planning officers factored P-38 patrol patterns into strike timing. Intelligence officers tracked P-38 squadron deployments. With the same priority as aircraft carrier movements, the P-38 Lightning had become more than a weapon system. It had become a strategic deterrent. Not because it prevented suicide pilot attacks entirely, but because it reduced their effectiveness by forcing poor timing, suboptimal approach vectors, and target selection based on avoiding engagement rather than maximizing damage. American pilots flying P-38 Lightnings understood the psychological advantage they possessed. Major Jake Thompson, America's top ace with 40 confirmed victories, flew P-38s throughout his Pacific service. In a letter home dated December 12, 1944, he wrote, "The Japanese fear the fork-tailed devil more than any other aircraft we fly. When we appeared, they scatter. Even their suicide pilots turn away. We are not just fighters. We are the manifestation of American industrial might." Every time a P-38 appears in their sky, they are reminded that America can build aircraft they cannot match, flown by pilots they cannot defeat, in numbers they cannot imagine. Major Thompson was correct about the numbers. By the end of 1944, Lockheed had produced 923 P-38 Lightnings. Detroit and California assembly lines were producing approximately 500 per month. Japanese intelligence estimated total production at maybe 2,000 aircraft. They were off by a factor of 5. When Japanese officers realized the true scale of American P-38 production, the psychological effect was devastating. They weren't fighting a technologically superior aircraft. They were fighting an industrial colossus that could produce raw technological power, faster than Japan could train pilots to fly inferior ones. But numbers alone don't explain fear. Fear comes from experience, from seeing something that should not be possible, from watching your squadron mates die in ways that defy everything your training taught you. Japanese pilots who survived P-38 encounters reported similar experiences. The fork-tailed devil appeared. It dove, it fired, it climbed away. All of this happened faster than reaction time allowed. The P-38's dive speed exceeded 500 mph. Its zoom climb capability meant it could regain altitude before Japanese fighter planes could even orient on its position. Fighting a P-38 Lightning was like fighting a ghost. It appeared, killed, and vanished before you could respond. The technical explanation for this seeming invincibility lies in the P-38's energy fighting capabilities. Energy fighting is a combat doctrine based on managing speed and altitude as interchangeable resources. Dive to build speed, use speed to climb, use altitude advantage to dive again. The P-38 Lightning's twin engines and high-altitude performance made it the ideal energy fighter. Japanese aircraft like the Zeros were designed as turn fighters, optimized for maneuverability. In a turning fight, a Zero could potentially outturn a P-38, but P-38 pilots did not turn fight. They boom and zoom attacked. Dive, fire, zoom climb, reposition, repeat. Japanese pilots had no counter-tactic. You cannot outturn an opponent who refuses to turn. You cannot outclimb an aircraft with superior power-to-weight ratio. You cannot outrun an aircraft 80 mph faster. Suicide pilots faced an even worse situation. Their tactics required straight-line approaches to maximize chances of hitting their targets. No evasive maneuvers, no defensive flying, just point aircraft at target and maintain course against P-38 Lightnings. This made suicide pilots easy targets. The nose-mounted armament package of the P-38 meant pinpoint accuracy, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon. All firing from a single point, no convergence issues, no need to account for bullet trajectory from wing-mounted guns. Just put the target in your crosshairs and fire. For suicide pilot aircraft, flying predictable straight-line approaches, P-38 pilots had time to line up shots, fire sustained bursts, and confirm kills before the suicide pilot got within a mile of American ships. The loss rates were staggering. Suicide missions targeting formations. With P-38 Lightning escort, achieved target strike rates below 15%. 85% of suicide pilot aircraft were destroyed before reaching their targets. Those numbers represent thousands of young Japanese pilots who died without achieving their mission objective, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked commitment, but because the P-38 Lightning represented a technological gap that willpower could not bridge. American engineering had created an aircraft so superior that even pilots willing to die could not overcome its advantages. This raw technological power extended beyond raw performance specifications. The P-38 Lightning was one of the first American fighters with a bubble canopy, providing exceptional visibility. Pilots could see threats in all directions. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft with limited rearward visibility, were constantly vulnerable to attacks they never saw coming. The P-38 was also one of the first American fighters with a tricycle landing gear, making takeoffs and landings safer and easier. This meant less training time required, more pilots qualified to fly the aircraft, and fewer accidents. Small details, technical minutiae, but collectively they represented an approach to aircraft design that prioritized pilot survival and operational efficiency. Japanese aircraft design philosophy prioritized performance over pilot comfort or safety. The result? American pilots flew longer tours, accumulated more experience, and survived situations that would have killed pilots in less forgiving aircraft. By December 1944, Japanese Suicide Pilot Command faced a crisis. The psychological effect of the P-38 Lightning was measurably reducing mission effectiveness. Pilots were requesting reassignment. Missions were being aborted. Target selection was being driven by fear rather than strategic value. Something had to change. The solution? Do not mention the P-38 Lightning in mission briefings unless absolutely necessary. Do not show pilots intelligence reports detailing P-38 capabilities. Do not acknowledge the raw technological power American forces possess. Create an information vacuum and hope that ignorance reduces fear. It did not work. Pilots talked. Veterans shared their experiences. The truth spread through suicide pilot units faster than official communications. By January 1945, every suicide pilot knew, if you see P-38 Lightnings, your mission is likely over before it begins. American commanders noticed the pattern. Intelligence reports documented suicide pilot missions that aborted upon detecting P-38 formations. Tactical officers began using P-38 squadrons as psychological warfare tools. Position visible, P-38 patrols near high-value targets. Make sure Japanese reconnaissance spotted them. Force suicide pilot planners to choose between high-value targets with P-38 coverage or lower-value targets without. Most chose the latter, not because of cowardice, but because of tactical reality. Why sacrifice dozens of pilots for a low-probability strike on a battleship when you could strike a transport ship with a higher probability of success? The P-38 Lightning was reshaping Japanese strategic thinking. Without firing a shot, this psychological warfare aspect of the P-38 Lightning is often overlooked in historical analysis. Historians focus on kill ratios, combat performance, technical specifications, all important. But the P-38's greatest contribution to American victory was not measured in aircraft destroyed. It was measured in missions the enemy chose not to fly, in targets the enemy chose not to attack, in strategic decisions driven by fear rather than opportunity. The P-38 Lightning did not just dominate the skies, it dominated the minds of those who had to fight beneath them. Your grandfather might have been one of those P-38 pilots, might have flown missions over the Pacific, never knowing that his mere presence overhead was preventing suicide pilot attacks, might have returned home thinking his service was routine, unaware that Japanese pilots were turning away rather than face his formation. That is the legacy of the arsenal of democracy, not just winning through superior firepower, but winning through superior technology that created psychological advantages as powerful as physical ones. The P-38 Lightning proved that in modern warfare, the weapon that inspires fear can be as effective as the weapon that inflicts damage. And here is what Japanese forces never discovered until after the war ended. American production was accelerating. Plans existed to produce 15,000 P-38 Lightnings by 1946. New variants with improved engines, increased range, and heavier armament were in development. If the war had continued, Japanese forces would have faced not just more P-38s, but better P-38s, flown by increasingly experienced pilots in numbers that would have made air defense impossible. The psychological effect of the P-38 Lightning in 1944 would have been nothing compared to what Japan would have faced in 1946. Lieutenant Takeo Yamamoto survived the war. In 1952, he was interviewed by American military historians researching suicide pilot tactics. When asked why he turned back on October 24, 1944, his answer was simple. "I wanted to die for my emperor. But I wanted my death to matter against the P-38 Lightning. My death would have meant nothing. They would have shot me down before I got close. My sacrifice would have changed nothing, so I turned back. Hoping for a mission where my death could make a difference. That mission never came, and I am grateful." The production numbers tell a story of American industrial might that Japanese planners never fully grasped. Between 1941 and 1945, Lockheed produced 10,037 P-38 Lightnings, Burbank, California. A single city, a single company, building an aircraft that terrified an empire. The production rate peaked in March 1944 at 525 aircraft completed in 1 month. That is 17 P-38 Lightnings per day. Japanese monthly fighter production across all manufacturers never exceeded 1,000 aircraft of all types. America was producing 17 of its most advanced fighters every single day from one factory line. But numbers tell only part of the story. Quality matters as much as quantity. Every P-38 Lightning that rolled off the Lockheed line in 1944 incorporated lessons learned from combat operations. Engineering changes based on pilot feedback. Improvements to engines based on field maintenance reports. Upgrades to armament based on effectiveness studies. The P-38 Lightning of 1945 was significantly superior to the P-38 of 1942. Japanese aircraft, constrained by limited industrial capacity and resources, could not match this continuous improvement cycle. A Zero built in 1945 was essentially the same as a Zero built in 1942, facing P-38s that were faster, more powerful, and more reliable than their predecessors. The human cost of this technological gap is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that P-38 Lightnings shot down over 2,200 Japanese aircraft during the war. But those confirmed kills do not account for the psychological casualties. The pilots who refused to fly after P-38 encounters. The missions aborted due to P-38 detection. The strategic decisions altered because P-38 formations made objectives too costly to pursue. The P-38 Lightning's true impact cannot be measured in kill counts alone. It must be measured in Japanese strategic paralysis, in opportunities not taken, in attacks not launched, in fear that shaped an empire's final desperate months. And the men who flew these aircraft were not superhuman. They were Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, men who just 6 months prior had been civilians, were now flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. That, my friends, is the raw power of the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't just about building superior weapons, it was about training ordinary men to use them extraordinarily well. Japanese aces, with years of hard-earned experience, feared the P-38 Lightning. American pilots, barely 6 months out of training, flew them with utter confidence. The difference? It wasn't just individual skill. It was systemic excellence, training programs that emphasized survival and effectiveness, maintenance systems that kept aircraft operational, logistics networks that ensured spare parts and fuel were always available. Captain Thomas Lynch flew P-38 Lightnings with the 39th Fighter Squadron in New Guinea. His combat diary, generously donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War back in 1978, provides invaluable insight into how American pilots viewed their psychological advantage. An entry dated November 15, 1943, reads, "We do not fear the enemy. We do not even think about them much. When we take off, we know we have the best aircraft. We know we have the best training. We know we have backup. If we are shot down, search and rescue will come. If our aircraft is damaged, maintenance will fix it." The Japanese do not have these assurances. They fly knowing they are alone, that it makes us psychologically invincible even before combat begins. And Captain Lynch was absolutely correct. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just a fighter aircraft. It was the visible manifestation of American systemic superiority, logistics, training, industrial capacity, technological innovation, pilot welfare. Every aspect of American air power was meticulously designed to maximize effectiveness and survivability. Japanese air power, on the other hand, was designed to maximize immediate combat performance, often at the expense of everything else. The result? Entirely predictable. American pilots flew longer tours, gained more experience, and survived situations that would have been fatal in Japanese aircraft. By 1945, the average P-38 pilot in the Pacific had significantly more combat experience than the average Japanese pilot. The veterans were on the American side, undeniably. The psychological impact of this experience gap compounded the technological gap. Japanese intelligence reports from early 1945 note with alarm the increasing skill of American pilots. They are no longer making mistakes we can exploit, the reports lamented. They fight with a precision that suggests extensive training. Their formation discipline is perfect. Their tactics are evolving faster than we can counter them. What those reports described wasn't some innate American superiority. It was the direct result of a system that kept pilots alive long enough to become genuine experts. P-38 pilots survived because their aircraft was tough. It had redundancy built in. 2 engines meant losing one wasn't necessarily fatal. Heavy armor protected critical systems. Robust construction absorbed damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. This survivability meant pilots learned from their mistakes. Instead of dying from them, remember that October 24, 1944 moment when Lieutenant Yamamoto turned back at 3:42 p.m. That single decision represents thousands of similar decisions made by Japanese pilots throughout the war. Decisions driven by fear of the P-38 Lightning. Decisions that collectively altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War. Each aborted mission was one less threat American forces faced. Each avoided engagement was one more American bomber crew that completed their mission. The cumulative effect staggering. The P-38 Lightning did not win the war by itself, but it created conditions that made American victory inevitable. So you've just discovered the classified truth about why even suicide pilots feared the P-38 Lightning. This isn't Hollywood mythology, folks. This is declassified intelligence from both American and Japanese sources. These are the real stories your history class never taught. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just factories churning out weapons. It was a complete system that turned American industrial might into psychological dominance. The P-38 Lightning terrified an empire, not because of any single capability, but because it represented everything Japan could not match: speed, range, firepower, reliability, producibility, and the systemic support structure that kept them flying and fighting. This history was buried in classified archive for decades. Your grandfather, who flew P-38s, probably never told you these stories. He came home, went back to work, raised a family, and rarely spoke about the war. That was the greatest generation. They did not boast. They did not seek glory. They served, returned, and resumed normal life. But their service created the world we live in today. The freedom we take for granted was bought with P-38 Lightnings, flown by men who were just doing their job, and part of that job was being so good, so effective, that the enemy chose not to fight rather than face them. If this story honored the legacy of those who served, if you felt pride in what American engineering and American courage achieved, the super thanks button below is not just support. It's you saying, "I honor the greatest generation." It tells YouTube, these stories matter. It keeps this history alive for your children and grandchildren who need to understand what their great-grandfathers accomplished. Corporate documentaries will not tell these stories. They're too focused on entertainment, too afraid of controversy, too interested in lowest common denominator content. Channels like this preserve the truth, the classified documents, the declassified reports, the human stories, behind the statistics. Your super thanks makes the next deep dive possible. It funds the research. It justifies the hours spent in archives. It honors those who served by ensuring their stories survive. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning extends beyond World War II. Modern fighter doctrine still incorporates lessons learned from P-38 operations. Energy fighting, boom and zoom tactics, the importance of range and endurance. The psychological value of technological superiority. American air power today traces its lineage directly to what P-38 pilots proved in the Pacific, that superior technology, properly employed by well-trained pilots and supported by robust logistics, creates advantages that transcend individual combat encounters. The F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning II, these modern fighters carry the same philosophy that made the P-38 Lightning devastating, dominate through systemic excellence, not just individual performance. But here's what matters most. Lieutenant Takeo Yamamoto, the suicide pilot who turned back, survived, and lived to age 79. He died in 2001, surrounded by family, in a Japan that had become one of America's closest allies. The young American pilots, who terrified him in P-38 Lightnings, came home, built businesses, raised families, and created the prosperous America of the 1950s through 1990s. The P-38 Lightning was a weapon of war. But the men and women who flew these magnificent machines were, at their core, builders of peace. They didn't fight because they cherished war, but because they loved what war threatened to destroy: home, family, freedom, the American way of life. It was all on the line. So every time you witness a beautifully restored P-38 Lightning soaring through the sky at an air show, remember what it truly represents. It's more than just a beautiful aircraft. It's far more than simply impressive engineering. It embodies that critical moment in history when American industrial might unequivocally proved that democracies could outbuild, outtrain, and outright defeat totalitarian empires. The P-38 Lightning is the physical, tangible embodiment of why free people, given enough time, will always defeat tyranny, because free people innovate, free people constantly improve, free people build systems that value and nurture human life and human potential. And when those systems are relentlessly focused on national defense, they become, quite simply, unstoppable. So, are you Team P-38 Lightning or Team P-51 Mustang? Which twin-engine versus single-engine debate do you fall on? Let us know your answer and why in the comments section below. And if your grandfather, or perhaps a great-uncle, flew P-38s in the Pacific Theater, please share his squadron and the specific area he served in. These personal connections to history truly matter. Every single comment helps YouTube understand that World War II history still resonates deeply, that the greatest generation's legacy continues to inspire, and that the arsenal of democracy still matters profoundly to Americans who deeply value the freedom those brave men and women secured for us.